Okay, so I'd like to introduce Dr. Kin Yuen. She's a sleep medicine specialist at UCSF who provides a range of treatments and other services for patients with sleep disorders. I'll let a few more people in as I'm doing this.
Sure.
Dr. Yuen earned her medical degree and completed a residency in internal medicine at the Albert Einstein College of Medicine. She completed a fellowship in sleep disorders at Stanford Medicine, where she also earned a master's degree in health research and policy. Before completing her fellowship, she practiced internal medicine at the Stanford Medical Group. And in 2019, she chaired an Associated Professional Sleep Society symposium on women and sleep disorders. So hopefully she'll talk about that as well. So welcome, Kin. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yes, thank you so much, Jill. I look forward to doing this. And thank you for participating. I was telling Jill that typically I like to be a little bit more interactive, and rather loose. So I love to have patients or others that respond so that I could answer the appropriate questions. So this format's a little bit interesting, but this is what we had to deal with during the pandemic. So I'm really glad to be able to spend your lunch hour with you and welcome. So today, just some simple guidelines because this session is being recorded. I would like to, if you want more information about particular personal questions, we'd like to take that offline. I do not want to have recorded personal information. And the nature of the talk is to share information with you. You are welcome to contact me through the Sleep Disorder Center. We are located in Post Street, which is across from Mount Zion campus. And with that, I'm going to start. So this is a very basic question that we often encounter. And can you all see my slides? I just want to make sure that's the case.
No, not yet.
Oh, really? Okay, I apologize. So let me go back, and I thought that we had uploaded the slides. So I apologize. Now?
Yes.
Okay, great. All right. Thank you. I kept talking and not realizing you couldn't see my slides. So we have gone over the slide. And so the very basic question is, why do we sleep, right? And it is one of those automatic processes that when it happens naturally, we are not aware of it. It's pretty much like breathing. When we try to tinker with our breathing, sometimes it gets worse because then we may breathe irregularly. So if you ever wonder why we don't count your breathing rate in front of you, it's because then we may breathe faster, we may breathe slower, all kinds of stuff can happen, right? So same thing with sleep. When it's going on track, we hardly notice it. So the only time that we know that there's a problem is when we don't sleep well. So what is the purpose? We know that we wake up, we should feel refreshed, and we really should not feel sleepy. And so if there are quality of life issues in that we feel sleepy, we feel tired, we don't feel refreshed, then perhaps there's a problem with our sleep. The very first question I ask very often would be the quantity. How much sleep should I have? And that could vary, depends on the age that we go through in life. And secondly, I like to talk about what may disturb the quality of our sleep and what we can do about it. And I'll touch upon 3 sleep disorders. One of them is going to be insomnia. I heard that there are some issues regarding insomnia. And then I would talk about restless legs. And lastly, I would talk about obstructive sleep apnea because we encounter that fairly often, particularly as we mature, and what may be some of the best practices for today. If time allows, I can answer general questions. Again, no personal details, please. Now, this question often would arise, how much sleep should we get? Now, I blame Benjamin Franklin in telling us that we should all be early risers and early to bed and we should get 8 hours of sleep. Well, while that is true, it's not always true for everyone, right? And so in general, once we are 18 years and older, we should perhaps aim for 7 to 9 hours. And it is a bell curve because some of us may get 8, some of us may get 7.5, and that's perfectly fine if we feel refreshed, we feel alert, we feel awake, we're ready for the day. Now, children, of course, should get more, particularly newborns, but you can see through the graphics that the time frame tends to shrink. Of course, when we're first born, we tend to sleep 16 or 18 hours, and we sleep in chunks. It's not until we're perhaps about 4 years old, then our sleep will be more consolidated into one chunk of nocturnal sleep and not requiring naps. Now, the other thing that is important, that busy slide, bear with me, we know that even from young adulthood into full adulthood, perhaps late 20s, early 30s, compared to, and they didn't fully define what older it means, but typically 65, 75 or older amongst the population, we don't spend as much time in nocturnal sleep, right? The other factor is that we are all, before COVID, been deprived of sleep because most adults were getting just about 7 hours. We know electricity, stress, and everything else have contributed because from the 1960-ish to the 1990s, we actually lost an hour of sleep per night. And so Americans in general before the pandemic have been sleep deprived. So some of it is because we have busy lives, there is work, there is commute, particularly in the Bay Area. Again, with us going back to work, that's become an issue again. So allotting enough time. And I'm going to talk about sleep stages. I heard that being mentioned earlier, which is great because that may shorten my talk to some degree in terms of why we do these, multiple electrodes to various parts of the body that disturb our sleep. Well, technology is getting better. But until then, the tools that we use, particularly Mount Zion, when we do sleep studies in the laboratory, there's a lot of interference with different kind of instruments. So the wireless system is probably not going to work very well for us. And so we are still relying on the old-fashioned electrodes. So in the laboratory, we tend to put electrodes around the forehead, the middle of the head, the back of the head, and these will record the so-called EEG, electroencephalograms, the brain waves. We typically look for the differential, the difference between electrodes. We subtract out the commonalities, so what is different is being displayed. And we also put electrodes around the eyes because the graphics here shows eye movements. And of course, when we go through sleep within each stage, the eyes produce different types of movement. I'll go through that a little bit. We monitor the chin electrodes because when we go into the dream cycles or rapid eye movement sleep, depicted again by these eye movements here, our so-called chin tone, the muscle tone, drops to the lowest level. And that would come in handy when I show your sleep stages in a second. And then we don't put electrodes typically on the arms unless there are other reasons, such as when people can move their arms or flail their arms chronically during sleep. We do put electrodes around the shins, so that's a wrong area to put them, around the shins, the front of the legs, for those that may have twitchy movements when they go into sleep and wake up from sleep. They usually couple belt across the chest and abdomen to look at the amount of movement that we may produce when we inhale and exhale. Again, looking for particularly breathing problems. And then with all of that, you're supposed to sleep and then microphone to record snoring. We know you're not getting a comparable night that you get at home, but we're comparing your data against other people that have spent the night in the laboratory, no matter how difficult it is. So the waveforms that we see are depicted here. Don't worry, you won't be quizzed about that. But in case you're wondering what those sleep trackers are telling you, when we are with the electrodes hooked up and then our eyes are closed, in 90% of individuals, it will show this so-called alpha pattern. Just that the lines, these wavy lines are fairly packed together at about 11 to about 13 cycles per second. Now, 10% of the population do not show these waveforms. And these are particularly more prominent towards the back of the head. That's why we need the back of the head as well as the front of the head. Now, the waveforms in the front of the head are better to tell us the depth of your sleep. Once behaviorally you look like you're asleep, we may think that we're drowsy, but our brain waves become a little bit wider apart. And now we have 4 to 7 cycles, and these look almost like shark's teeth, right? Sawtoothy pattern. So this is quite particular for both stage 1, very light stage of sleep, and rapid eye movement sleep, the dream cycles. So I cannot tell them apart if I just look at the brainwaves alone. So that's why we need the eye trackers and also the chin to tell me that if we're in rapid eye movement cycle, I will see this brainwave pattern, but the chin tone will be very, very low, and the eyes will be darting back and forth like we're watching a movie in our brains. So stage 1 and REM sleep look a lot alike. Stage 2, still light stage of sleep. So in terms of patient's experience, sometimes we have this discrepancy that technologists may tell the patient, oh, you've been asleep for hours, and the patient would tell us, I've been wide awake the whole time. What are you talking about? So part of the reason is that we may be switching in very, very light stage of sleep back and forth and not really entering into what we call deep sleep or slow wave sleep. So the patient would think that he or she is wide awake, or they, and then the technologist would say, no, we have enough sleep, it's time to go home. So those are the typical reasons, because we never really quite got out of light stage of sleep. And so stage 2 is still light stage of sleep, but sound and light will become intermittently received, if at all. But we know that in stage 2, we can still hear some sounds if they are of certain decibel or their certain loudness. So we know sound can also precipitate these so-called K complexes. So we have done experiments with some subjects to see if we can induce a certain pattern of these sounds. So that indicates that there is some sound perception even in light stage of sleep. And of course, finally, what we call slow wave sleep. We used to have stage 3 and stage 4, but nowadays it's all combined into one, stage 3. As you can see, the waveforms are a lot sparser, a lot more air, right, between the waveforms. Well, part of common aging is that, of course, there's some shrinkage in our brain sizes. And so we don't see these waveforms as easily as we mature compared to when we were teenagers and young adults. So that's the reason that we have added electrodes in the front so that we can see these waveforms a little bit better as we mature. So what are the differences? Why do we need all these sleep stages? Well, we believe that in so-called slow wave sleep, pardon my analogy, even though it's being recorded, but I like to say it's kind of like the brain is flushing its toilet. So we have all this buildup of tau protein that you hear so much about. We hear about amyloid plaques. Well, we can all have these in our brains normally, except that when we're in this stage of sleep, the brain literally will flush it out into our bloodstream. But the condition is such that we need the blood pressure and the pores from the blood-brain barrier to our bloodstream to be open. So if those pores are not open because there's some disruption, then we cannot empty out those repair products into our bloodstream. And we may not get enough of this stage of sleep. The consequence would be that we would feel more tired during the day. We don't feel as rested. So those can be some of the reasons. Now, this shows us what we look at in terms of hypnogram. Now, this happens to be a fairly good sleeper in that when we analyze the entire night and add up all those cycles of sleep, we can see this person fell asleep fairly quickly, drop literally into, when it falls down, we fell into sleep stage 1, then proceeded to stage 2, then went to stage 3, woke up a little bit to stage 2, and went into the dream cycle, right? So we have this typical cycling, going through dream cycle 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times. There may be a couple of awakenings, which are normal because we have to ensure that we are safe. Why is that important? Well, one thing I did not mention is that when we're in rapid eye movement sleep, we're meant to be paralyzed. So in case we're playing golf, in case we're playing pickleball, in case we are bingoing, whatever the reasons are, or playing board games, or maybe we're in conversation, we should not have the ability to move and injure ourselves or those around us when we're asleep. And so it's natural that we have sleep paralysis. Well, but when we're paralyzed, we could be at the mercy of a predator. So the brain does program in a certain number of times that we awaken during the night. We are not conscious of these unless it happens 4 hours in, for instance, the third REM cycle. If we wake up in the middle here, then we may have a harder time going back to sleep. But if we awaken within the first 3 or 4 hours, we just go right back and we go through another cycle. In terms of learning, whether it is foreign language, whether we want to crochet, whatever, we need the cycling to help those memory and experiences stick so that that can be encoded into an easier access the next day. But if the cycling is interfered with, then we may have a hard time remembering our experiences from the night before or from a week ago, and even recalling, right? What is that gentleman's name? I had just met him, that kind of thing. Now, in comparison, this is a disrupted night's sleep. Again, for those of you that may be using sleep trackers, you can see, even without the introduction, the number of times this person might have awakened, right, during the night. The REM sleep, actually, this person has more cycles than the previous one, but they generally shorter in duration. They don't get longer and longer as the night progressed. And the deep sleep is actually shifting back and forth between light stages sleep and deep sleep. So this is a more disturbed night's sleep compared to that, right? And so the naked eye can pick that apart. So that's why I love graphics. When you have a sleep study, make sure that you your sleep practitioner discuss what your hypnogram looks like with you. While they may have the same quantity of sleep going across, about 7.5 to perhaps 7.75 sleep, duration wise is 6, so that would be 7. But the quality is different because this person definitely had more disrupted night sleep with multiple transitions between stages and multiple awakenings. Now, we know, again, as one of you have mentioned, that the sleep changes, right, as we mature, as well it should, because when we're younger, the brain is actively growing. So majority of the time, the brain is asleep. Actually, a fact that you probably know is that most infants go into the sleep stages throughout dream cycles. So their eyes would begin to move right away as soon as they drifted off to sleep. And then about 6 months to about a year's time, then we go into so-called adult pattern when we go into sleep through all the other sleep stages, stage 1, stage 2, and then stage 3, and then we go into REM sleep, as I mentioned earlier. Now, as we approach 70s, 80s, 90s, of course, we can spend more time awake, and our nocturnal sleep tend to be in chunks, at least 2. And with awakenings between the 2 chunks, and about 75 and older is when the amount of dream cycle can decrease. So prior to that, we are pretty stabilized from adulthood into about 65 at 25% of our sleep should be in REM sleep, unless there's something interrupting it. And I will proceed to talk about that. But this is a fairly normal progression in our sleep. And so because if we are used to sleeping in one consolidated chunk, and now we're sleeping instead in 2 and possibly 3 chunks, we may believe that now we have acquired insomnia, right? And we need to do something about it. However, when we look at anthropological studies and also nomadic tribes that do not use electricity, they tend to sleep in 2 chunks, 3-4 hours, and then another 3 or 4 hours. And there may be a break of about, perhaps an hour in between where they may socialize around the fire, they may converse, they may do other things, they may eat, and then they will sleep again for another 3 or 4 hours. So it's a very artificial construct that we sleep in one solid chunk, and that's the case with electricity, basically invention of electricity. We know also as we mature, there is a higher tendency to, again, complain about insomnia, but the numbers are pretty consistent. About half the population may have an issue with insomnia, which is why I'm going to talk about that first. And then snoring and sleep apnea, we'll talk about last. And I will touch upon restless legs because that seems to be the segue between insomnia and also sometimes having sleep apnea. So first of all, we don't have to just rely on sleep study, we do rely on sleep trackers. And however, this could become a stimulus for some people to pay too much attention, right? Just because, well, I got 7.5 hours sleep last night. Tonight I'm getting 8. Is that okay? So for some people that may fixate on data, we would say that may not be so healthy for you. For other people, it's probably perfectly okay to use this as an adjunctive tool to help us understand how you sleep. So insomnia first, which is a disruption in your sleep, it is pretty common. And we talk about episodic insomnia, right? So whether it's a happy event that we are attending a wedding, perhaps of a child, or birth of a grandchild, or that graduation ceremonies, or something sad, like worry about taxes. And with COVID, there's been so much trauma going on. So it is quite common for us to hear about symptoms of insomnia if it happens once in a while. The problem is going to be when it's persistent. So chronic insomnia is defined by having a problem either going to sleep, right, or staying asleep at least a few times a week, 2 or 3 times for at least 3 months. And we are affected by daytime sleepiness, fatigue, and we have trouble concentrating. It's interfering with our social life, such as work or our interactions with others. And this is a useful model, although Dr. Arthur Spielman from the City College in New York had passed away, but it's a very handy model for us to understand how do we get here. So number one is that we all carry certain biological traits and maybe psychological predispositions along with how we were raised, whether we were raised in a crowded environment, noisy environment, quiet environment. So all of those are conditioning factors. The more we are careful, the more we are meticulous, the more likely we're going to carry a little bit of those obsessive compulsive traits. Normally, they work for us, right? Because the more careful we are, the more likely we're going to go over those numbers over and over again to ensure if you're a CPA that you have the right information. If we were physicians like myself, that I may ruminate about a patient and the workup for this patient to ensure that we have the correct diagnosis and treatment option, right? So those things that normally work for us can be predisposing factors. Now, precipitating factors can be various. There could be medical illness, testing positive for COVID. It could be because someone is ill in the family or someone is undergoing a stressful life situation, perhaps a divorce, perhaps being audited by the IRS, you name it. But typically there is something that may push us over the edge so that we may have incidental insomnia for that particular situation. For me, I can tell you it's because right before I had my MCAT exam, trying to get into medical school, and I didn't sleep well the night before because our neighbor was incredibly noisy the night before. So that set me up for a night of insomnia. But when the exam was over, I recovered, right? So these are incidental precipitants. What happens afterwards, though, the so-called perpetuating factors, what we do to try to get better, because we inherently do not have control over our sleep. So very often we try to make sleep more predictable. Like I talked to one of the patients is that, well, if you're going to use earplugs for sound, you can use the eye mask on top of the blackout drapes, and you're going to do a certain, length of yoga. All that is well and good, but the more variables you add to your routine that you require, let's say there's a fan, there's a sound machine. So the more things that you add onto that equation, the less reproducible that's going to be. Right? What if when you travel and you don't have all these things available with you, or you forgot one item, then does that doom your sleep that night? So probably the less is better. And once we cross that threshold, however, and then we are talking about reproducibility. So how likely are you going to be able to reproduce all those requirements? So editing is probably a good thing. Now, we know that we have a certain propensity to be hypervigilant, and I'm going to talk about a little bit hormone. And in that, in women, we are actually born with a certain number of brain cells that cause us to secrete more stress hormone, again, relatively compared to men. And so we tend to have the ability to perhaps wake up a little bit faster and to be reactive to stress a little faster. Now, having said that, those individuals that may have symptoms of depression or have undergone or witnessed trauma, they might be primed with these stress hormones on board already. And so really doesn't take a lot to cross that threshold to make this person more susceptible to insomnia. So with normal amount estrogen on board, usually, and there is no other trauma influencing our development around puberty. So normally female hormones are protective against disruptions, particularly in attention in certain part of the brain, which is the bottom of the brain. And so during cycling, we like to say, with regular menses, this may also influence how susceptible we are to symptoms of insomnia. So when estrogen levels are low, either around onset of menses or around menopause, or those that may have less estrogen on board, like those that may have polycystic ovary syndrome, then they might be more prone to have symptoms of insomnia compared to, let's say, mid-cycle when the estrogen levels tend to be a little bit higher. So there are some biological reasons why women are more likely to exhibit symptoms of insomnia. Now, as an aside, I think this is an important piece because very often by the time the patients get to us, they have tried alcohol, they have tried antihistamines, which are predominantly most over-the-counter medications to treat so-called insomnia. So this is a statement by the American College of Physicians that looked into efficacy, right, of these over-the-counter medications. Very popular, very available, except that they have very small to moderate efficacy. And the issue is that we get sedated, and sometimes we may even get lightheaded and dizzy the next morning. And we can quickly develop tolerance to the medication in that you may take the same dose today, they worked, tomorrow they work less well, the day after, probably not working at all, yet they produce side effects. So I think these are some of the dangers of the over-the-counter medication that we should be aware of. Now, what do we do instead? Of course, there are medications available that we use as sleep specialists. I won't go to all of them here, but the more important piece is how do we teach methods for better sleep? And so I think as one of you has mentioned earlier, acceptance. So first thing is to understand that having insomnia is a naturally protective mechanism for all of us. Imagine, again, caveman days, we're all good sleepers and we're all sound sleepers. Well, who is going to watch out for the predator, right? We probably would have been wiped out a long time ago. So we need some people who are able to not only understand that the predator's out there, but to alert the rest of the tribe so that we can all survive. So we need to temper down that hypervigilance, hyperarousal response. So we no longer go through the habitual habits that we have. So we want to have the brain not activate so easily. So one of the ways to do that is through something called cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, where we can, again, temper down the increase in heart rate, increase in blood pressure, the rumination. And so we want to reserve the bed for sleep or sex. And we don't want to decrease the sleep pressure that we so carefully build up during the day to dissipate during sleep. And so the longer we stay up, the more pressure there is to go into deeper sleep, right? That slow wave sleep. We'll go through stage 1, stage 2, kind of like taking a tour, and quickly go into slow wave sleep and then REM sleep. And we do not want to use the bed, or we don't want to go to bed unless we're truly sleepy. So for those of us that have been afflicted by insomnia chronically, very often they would tell us, I actually don't know when I'm sleepy. I can tell you that I'm tired. So if I'm tired, I should go to bed, right? Well, my analogy is if you finish your triathlon at 10 o'clock in the morning, you are tired. You want to sit down or lie on the pavement, but you shouldn't fall asleep because it's 10 o'clock in the morning. And so there is a difference, and we do have to retrain the brain to understand what are the signs that you are actually sleepy and you're ready to go to bed. Timing is very important. And I think this is the most misunderstood part of the sleep therapy, in that, well, if you're a night owl and your brain wants to go to sleep at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, but you're trying to force yourself to go to sleep at 10, not only are you flying eastward to the East Coast, you may be adrift in the Atlantic Ocean every single night to try to go to sleep. So that's never going to work for you. And there are methods that we can help you with to kind of retrain the brain so that we don't force ourselves to go to bed at too early a time that's inconsistent with our biological clock. So for example, so-called sleep restriction is to literally restrict the amount of time that one spend in bed. So some of our patients can spend 10 hours or more lying in bed, not sleeping. Because if this person is not meant to go to sleep, this is midnight, so 1, 2 o'clock in the morning, and they spend hours lying awake in bed, how is that going to be useful, right? So I'd like to, again, make an analogy. If you're doing a project that you know is going to be 50% effective, you're not going to spend 10 hours working on something that's only going to give you 4 or 5 hours of productivity. You're just not going to do that. But yet we do that with sleep, try to catch sleep, right? And so once this person is able to achieve about 85% so-called sleep efficiency, amount of sleep they got relative to the amount of time they spend in bed, we will gradually lengthen the time that's allowable in bed. So by doing this, we are trying to get rid of a lot of the negative connection between your bed and insomnia, and help you foster some of the positive connections between restful sleep and your bed. That way we feel less anxious, we'll ruminate a little bit less, and hopefully the sleep will be, again, of better quality. And other things that we'd like you not to do, such as watching the clock, because when we watch the clock, what do? We subtract backwards. Well, I need to be up at 8, and therefore now I only have 3 hours to sleep, and now it's 2 hours, and now it's an hour. Might as well get up now, right? So it actually causes us to become to catastrophize about the next day's performance, and then we try to go to sleep. Well, trying doesn't help, because very often we are not able to. When the brain is not ready, trying is actually a process that we want to eliminate. What do we want you to do? Well, we want you to find activities that are calming to you and that are relaxing to you. But whatever that activity is, we would like you not to engage electronic devices, simply because I'm sure you are all heard about the blue light and the negativity with the news, social media. So all of that is not helpful to our sleep. And we would like you to do that at least an hour before you go to sleep. Just turn everything down. So what can you do? You can listen to a podcast. You could read a physical book under dimmer lighting. Now, I think in energy saving, the light bulbs are great, but they also emit a brighter spectrum. So, and in those light bulbs, they tend to be white or blue spectrum lights. So actually incandescent lighting, or the red spectrum lights, are more helpful for sleep, to the extent that the astronauts training for the Martian departure, the first crop were not able to adjust to Mars because they neglected with those pods that the astronauts being trained at to install red lighting or red spectrum light for their nighttime. And instead they get exposed to the white spectrum light that was not helpful. Avoid vigorous activity. Makes sense, right? If your brain's very active and at high metabolism, is not going to want to rest. It's like sleeping in the sauna. You might be able to sleep, but your sleep quality is going to suffer. But oops, sorry about that. Do exercise during the day, because there are two things under your control. Cardio exercise doesn't have to be vigorous. It could be gentle walking, could be Tai Chi, it could be restorative yoga. The more cardio that you do, the more you're accumulating the pressure to go into deeper sleep. but during the day. We don't want you to do this again 4 hours before your bed, right? And lastly, we need a safe and conducive environment. What does that mean? It really depends on you. So conducive to sleep for me could be sleeping at 68 degrees Fahrenheit. For you, it could be 60 degrees, 72 degrees, highly variable in terms of what we can tolerate. And safety is important. The reason being that, again, for those that have had trauma, it's very hard to go to sleep at the time of their trauma. So some of my patients had trauma at nighttime when they were in bed. So that is probably not going to be a safe environment for that individual, and they would feel much safer sleeping during the day when there are others around. So that circumstance really depends on what your personal needs are. And between bed partners, they can be completely different nowadays, including the firmness of the mattress, right? And also for those that were raised in an urban setting, that may be such as New York City, where I went to medical school. I was used to sirens going off all the time, particularly near a hospital. But at a more suburban area or rural area when one may have been raised, then having sirens all the time is very disruptive to sleep. So however you were raised and that you're comfortable with, we want to reproduce that environment. So putting someone who was raised in an urban environment into a very quiet and soundproof environment, it may not work. All right. So just be aware of what your needs are. Now, there are phone apps as well as online platforms, and these are developed by psychologists that we work with that do teach cognitive behavioral therapy, and medical insurance typically will cover some of this aspect. Bottom line is that we want to teach you new habits, and we want to form new connections for your sleep. Again, things that that you have done before. May not work, right? And for those that they have not worked, then we need to acquire, like any other habit, we need to acquire newer habits so that these can form a stronger bond with your sleep so that we can have a positive experience when we go to sleep. Ask any kid, you tell them you can stay up all night, you don't have to go to sleep, overly excited, and then sleep will overcome them. So as adults, we know that sleep pressure will reliably make us go to sleep because when we don't sleep enough, we get sleepy during the day. That's how we can tell. All right. And sleep diaries is something that we use. This is by the American Academy of Sleep Medicine. You can choose any variety. I know that UCSF, our forms are quite small. The fonts are very small. So you're welcome to use any other type of sleep diary that you choose. That at least you can fill out the morning of. Again, we don't want to prime you to have insomnia, so we want to fill them out the next morning when you are perhaps getting some sunlight, perhaps your breakfast. And simply put, we just want to know what time you went down. So it could be down arrow or line. Fill up the boxes when you estimate that you've been asleep, estimate the amount of time that you were awake, any caffeine use during the day, any naps during the day, any alcohol use and exercise. So however you want to denote your sleep diary is entirely up to you. And you can bring that in with Sleep Tracker. We do want you to work with pen and paper. It helps you organize your thoughts and help you reflect back on your sleep from the night before. So if you went to bed 2.5 hours earlier than your sleep, we want you to be out of bed here. So a lot of times people would say, well, if I'm not watching the clock and you want me out of bed when I'm not sleeping, how long do I spend in bed? I would usually say rule of thumb, if you're switching from one side to the other side and back, it's probably time to get up out of bed and do something else. Now, switching gears a little bit, restless legs, I won't have enough time to talk about sleep apnea. Restless legs, it is a very ill-defined syndrome that I'm sure some of you would have because they're pretty common. Now, these are different from cramps. We do get more leg cramps or calf cramps as we mature as well because number one, the muscles can get fatigued a lot faster. Number two, we may be taking different medications that can cause that to happen, or we may not be hydrating enough. So this is a sense or urge to move our legs, but not always accompanied by a sense of discomfort. But of those that do have these syndromes, they would say, I feel like maybe someone's tickling my legs on the inside or soda pop going off. Usually not painful, gets better when we move, gets worse when we don't move. Pretty common. Don't worry about all those gene mutations that have been noted here. But if both parents have it, chances are one of the children, 50-50, will have this as well. So they tend to run in families. Most often they go away, but it affects a fair amount of the adult and pediatric population. Of those that don't resolve, very often those will become progressively worse, meaning that they have these symptoms more than 3 times per week. Now, I like this graphics by Dr. Trenwater, which is that, well, we have a lot of gene mutations. It really doesn't take a lot of environmental factors for us to present even as a kid. But if we don't have so many gene mutations, then it will take a fair amount of maybe kidney problems, iron deficiency because we change our diet to cut out red meat. There may be diabetes involved. There might have been injuries involved. So it would take a lot more to uncover restless legs. So what's the problem with restless legs? There isn't per se, unless we cannot sleep or we can't find a comfortable position to get to sleep. And once we wake up, the legs may bother us again once more, and now we cannot get back to sleep. So it may present as insomnia, and we may have poor sleep quality. So the goal is to make sure the iron level that we're absorbing is sufficient to keep something called ferritin, which is the binding protein to iron, sufficient, either replacement by mouth or for those that are not able to get to a higher level by mouth, we can do this by vein. Some medications that we use, including sleeping pills, sometimes, but mostly behaviorally through moderate degree of exercise. When we over-exercise, it can make the syndrome worse. Ice and heat works, but they both work, rather, massages, avoiding stimulants that may worsen the leg movement, and some medications like some antidepressants can make them worse. There are vibrating devices, quite expensive though, that has gotten FDA approval to treat the syndrome. Lastly, there are prescription medications that are also available for those that do have severe symptoms, which is on a nightly basis. Certainly talk to a medical provider about treating that. And then those things that can make us very sleepy during the day, obstructive sleep apnea is pretty common. We are estimating that we are just seeing the tip of the iceberg. We tend to become sleepy during the day, which may lead to car accidents without us recognizing we're that sleepy. So these are accidents without skid marks because the eyes are closed, we cannot react. The comorbid conditions, including we may see concurrent with loud snoring that bothers someone else or wakes up the next hotel room guests, may include high blood pressure, type 2 diabetes, arrhythmias, something called atrial fibrillation, when the top part of the heart is beating very rapidly and irregularly. It may also coincide with possibly a heart attack. It may occur with symptoms of depression. Again, it can present insomnia because we can wake up repeatedly during the night from irregular breathing or stoppages in breathing. It can also happen just like blood pressure could be affected. The eye's blood pressure, which is glaucoma, can be elevated as well. And then symptoms of dementia may also worsen from a lack of oxygen and maybe that deep sleep that we were supposed to have to empty out all the toxins that were building up gets stalled out. And now we have more accumulations in the beta amyloid proteins and also tau proteins. So what this graphic is trying to show, airflow normally should come through the nose. It should go around through the back of the throat into our breathing tube, trachea, into the lungs, but there's a structural blockage here between the soft palate and then the bottom of the tongue. So the air is not able to get through and we cannot exhale adequately. This is just an aside to ask you to perhaps those that you suspect may have sleep apnea, how well is your medical provider, even in the Bay Area, know how to screen for obstructive sleep apnea, okay? So this is a survey in multiple states. in research practice in asking them how often and how many people with obstructive sleep apnea have you helped to diagnose. One practitioner said not a single one. Well, how can that be? Because we know this is such a common disorder, right? The tools that we use is something like this, Epworth Sleepiness Scale, which are 8 questions to ask you how likely are you to doze off when you're inactive, such as watching a program, as a passenger in a car, lying down in the afternoon, and so on. The higher the chances that you would doze off, obviously the overall score is going to be. The highest is 24 out of 8 questions. Anything more than 10 would suggest that you are very sleepy and that you may want to talk to someone about that. Now, having said that, some people don't ever get sleepy because they have a lot of hormones that help them stay awake. So it's not a perfect tool by any means. And it's also biased to some degree. We do have a pediatric version as well for children. And then there's something that you might have been screened for by your primary care provider, something called Stop Bang. It is gender specific in that a man is one risk factor. So anything more than 5 is considered abnormal. And so if you've been asked these questions, congratulate your primary care provider in that they actually are careful in screening for obstructive sleep apnea for you. Now, a certain population can present with sleep apnea much more frequently compared to others because sleep apneas tend to affect us when we go through the rapid eye movement cycle, so-called dream cycle, and that can cause us to have some degree of attention deficit. So amongst those that are afflicted by attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, there's a fairly high chance they may have breathing problems. In those that may prone to depressive symptoms, again, do ask whether that person may have snoring on a fairly regular basis because they too may have obstructive sleep apnea. And then being a minority population ourselves, but certainly I will talk about facial features in a second, but the other populations are African Americans, Latinos, and also Native Americans. Part of it can be related to our body weight distribution being a little bit higher, but even without that, there is a higher presentation of sleep apnea in the minority population. Some of it has to do, again, being Asian myself, with our features. So some of it has to do with the mid-face being a little bit shorter, again, relative to Caucasians. The jaw position, the lower jaw may be a little bit further back compared to the upper jaw. So the tongue doesn't have too far to go to block the airway. And lastly, is this kind of the human wishbone? The position tends to be a little bit lower. So it may be torquing the airway much more so compared to our Caucasian counterparts, which we have gone over. So some fun pictures. And now, usually, even when I see patients by telemedicine, I will ask some patient to do a couple of things. One of them is so that situate their faces so that I can see their nostrils. So I'm looking for symmetry. I'm also looking to see if the wing of the nose gets collapsed down, as in this case. So the valve actually is not working right, doing inhalation. So this person's relying on one side to do all the breathing. The other is that do they have a crease around the nose? And you could do this with your own family members. So this is probably from allergies that this person might have experienced as a child, and therefore from rubbing out noses, literally creating this horizontal crease. So it doesn't mean that this person will have sleep apnea, but there's a higher chance of that developing. And then, of course, the chin that we talked about, it was a little bit smaller, a little bit more receded. Again, the tongue is going to be in a backwards position more commonly compared to those that don't have this presentation. Now, what does teeth grinding have to do with it? This person not only has chips throughout, but these are ground down to a nub around the bottom teeth, right? So if the teeth is somehow on end, malaligned, and there's a lot of clenching, it speaks to jaw tension. And there may be, the culprit could be that the tongue is in slightly irregular position, and the tongue may be more likely to be trapped during sleep. Now, this is someone looking at someone's jaw, the front teeth here, upper jaw, and I think we can all see that this is a pretty high arch jaw and rather narrow, right? So how is the tongue going to fit within the confines of this little cage? And it doesn't. So very often, again, the tongue is more likely to push forward, make more room for itself, or it's going to push backwards and blocking our airways. And particularly if this person is sitting with the tongue out, right? That tells you the tongue doesn't fit. It's trying to break out of jail, and that presents a problem, particularly when the jaw is more relaxed when we go through the dream cycle. And sometimes there is, believe it or not, there's a reason why we ask it, you say, ah. And part of it is to see the opening in the back of the throat, how much opening we can see. The higher the tongue position, the less likely we can see the opening, meaning that you may have, or one may have a hyperreactive gag. That could point to the fact that the opening in the back is fairly narrow, and that may suggest that there has been trauma to the back of the throat, including the soft palate, the uvula, sometimes even the sidewall. So this is normal, that is not. So this is a concrete picture. This person has a fairly large, wide uvula. It's a little bit long. You can actually see a little bit tonsils in the back of the throat. The tongue is large. Why do I say that? Because there are teeth marks on the side. While I may see a little bit teeth marks here, I shouldn't see almost like circumferential teeth marks towards the front of the tongue, right? So that means that there is very little room, and there's some redness here. So this person may have either post-nasal drip or even heartburn, reflux symptoms. So this picture will be very suspicious of someone having sleep apnea. I'm going to skip this. There are different treatment options, surgical being one of them. There are positioning devices that we can either attach as a bell or could be taped to the nape of the neck so that the vibrations may wake us up from sleep and not lie on one's back, because that makes breathing worse. There are dental devices that we can use with the collaboration with a dentist. There are expanders for the teeth or the jaw to make more room for the tongue to fit. And then this is a hypoglossal nerve stimulator. They're heavily being marketed by commercials to our sleep apnea patients. But I like to say, is it indwelling device? If you want more information, do talk with one of us. But there's a misconception that we just use a remote control and that would be effective treatments. Like, no, there's an indwelling device. It has a battery. The battery has to be changed maybe every 10 to 15 years. So not completely benign treatment, but there are commercials on television advertising this treatment. And they do work. There are CPAP machines that you probably have heard about. These are various different masks. The only piece I want to say about that is if you own one of these machines or your family member owns one of these machines, please be advised that they are under recall, and please register. It's by FDA's requirement that you register and hopefully get your machine fixed. Again, these slides will be available through the recording, and I do have other resources available at the end of this talk as well. These are travel units. This one's out. Again, it's under recall. So these are still available. These two tend to be fairly loud. So this is probably the only game in town right now. So these are the resources. So for someone that needed a CPAP, couldn't get one in the past, the American Sleep Apnea Association and also Breathe California had loaned out or donated refurbished units. With COVID, that is not possible. We don't know when these programs would be in place again for those that cannot afford a unit. And if you own one of the older units you no longer use, and is not a recalled unit, consider donating them to others that cannot afford to have one. Of course, they do need to have some way to get masks and supplies. So in summary, like to say on a happy note that amongst the myriad of sleep disorders that we see patients for, mostly they are treatable. And be aware that obstructive sleep apnea can present in children and kids. No child should snore, and they can present in atypical ways. So in children, they can cause attention deficit hyperactivity, in adults as well. And those that may have recurrent migraine headaches, atrial fibrillations, arrhythmias after stroke, they may have sleep apnea or another variety that I did not discuss, something called central sleep apnea. And then any sleep disorder, including insomnia, can induce daytime sleepiness, particularly if there have been motor vehicle accidents from sleepiness, then this person ought to seek medical attention. Now, chronic insomnia that might be resistant to medication and other behavioral type of treatment, we can certainly advise you on a course of treatment that may be more beneficial. So other resources available, including the American Family Sleep Medicine, Public Safety, otherwise Sleep Foundation, American Thoracic Society, and then of course, American Academy of Pediatrics for those that have younger children on board. And with all of that, like to thank you for your attention, that our clinic is over on Post Street, and we see, at our clinic, we see adult patients only, but we do have a pediatric aspect of the clinic that we can certainly refer you to if there is a need. With that, I'm going to stop and see if there are any questions.
I'm going to
actually Roger that has a question, and
Okay.
he wants to know about eye mask. Is that a good idea to wear?
Yeah, it depends. So the one thing that I wish I had more time to expand on, again, is what is the appropriate bedtime schedule for you, right? Because we all have these internal genetics that would determine, are we a morning person? Are we the intermediate? Are we more of a night owl? So I think that for those of us that may be more of a night owl that needs to have less light input, because we know that we get awakened in the morning. I'm not against eye masks. There are all kinds of different kinds, you know, whether they're silk, whether they are different material, the thickness and so forth. And I think for those, we need more hands-on. You can't just, I mean, you can buy them through Amazon, but on the other hand, it's hard to know how it feels on your body. So particularly because a very common thing that people wear eye masks tend to do, they want to see if there's light coming through, right? But that's why you're wearing eye masks. So I think without the ability to try them out, it's going to be hard to know what's going to fit your face, because something that's very large, we may still get some light going through the nasal bridge. And so, you know, it wouldn't be necessarily helpful. Scented versus non-scented, that's another question I get asked very often. Yeah. And that depends on you, right? So some people like a little bit weight to them. They like them to be lavender filled. And so lavender tends to be a little bit relaxing. So if that's your cup of tea, by all means, get those. Some of us would like them to be lighter weight so that it doesn't, you know, push on the eyeballs, and that's legit as well. And so there's no brand that we endorse. It's really, you know, trial and error. But in generally, of course, you want them to cover the entire eye socket, and so that you don't have to constantly check to see if there's light filtering through.
Thank you.
Sure.
We have a couple of questions in the chat. Let's see. How safe and effective is melatonin?
Great question. The reason that has become an issue during the pandemic is that more people are using it because we do have some of us do have more depressive symptoms, anxiety, and kids. So because a lot of the parents are now expert teachers, and they find it, if their kids are able to go to sleep at a habitual hour and wake up at a habitual hour, it's just less stressful. So as a result of that, and also melatonin gummies that have been on the market, unfortunately, like Tide Pods, more kids have gotten their hands on them. So there's actually been more accidents in regards to melatonin overdose. Now, having said that, what is an appropriate level? How much do we need? And are there any brand endorsements? Again, we don't tend to endorse brands. So we would like to say, look for the USP seal, which is that at least the pharmacist and the compendium organization that look at the amount that is in melatonin that has been studied. Okay, so the USP seal is helpful. Now, unfortunately, there's also a study being fairly old now, 2016 study with the Canadian sleep researchers, they and Consumer Reports, they purchase melatonin supplements off the shelf. A little bit dated study, but to see chemically how much melatonin is being contained in these tablets, capsules, liquids, and are they consistent? So one, nope, no consistency. Some are placebo. Basically, you bought sugar pills. They have no active ingredients. Others have variable amounts, yet others contain serotonin, which we know as our happy hormone. And so if there's a lot of serotonin on board, we ain't gonna sleep. So that's the issue. So I will refer you to Consumers Report because I believe that they do name names, so you could check out which brand is a little bit more reliable. Now, dosage. Most commercially available melatonin is kind of overdosing, most of us, because we only need a very small amount, anywhere from 1 to 3 milligrams at most, except for those that are non-sighted, meaning not just legally blind, they have no light perception. Those that might have tumors involving parts of the brain that was removed that makes melatonin. And those that may have other sleep disorders that I didn't talk about today that require higher dose melatonin to try to treat. And those would be REM sleep behavior disorder. Instead of prescription medication, sometimes we use melatonin. And even restless legs, sometimes we use melatonin as well. So for those individuals, they may need higher dose. So most others, 1 to 3 milligrams should work fine. Timing, no consensus. Just because very often for people that have insomnia, we have talked about, may have a tendency to go to bed too early for them. So for example, if your internal clock is willing to go to bed at 1 a.m. and you're taking your melatonin at 10, it's probably not going to work for you. It doesn't matter if you take 10 milligrams or 15 milligrams or even double that, which is not advisable to do. But if you're going to sleep at 1 a.m. and you take your melatonin at 12, then you have a much higher chance of having that work for you. Now, one word of caution though, we can get nightmares from the use of melatonin, all right? And we could be sedated in the morning when we wake up. So again, test it out so the next day you don't have any engagements that will impair your ability to drive or do other activities. And if you don't need it, that will be better.
There's a question about interrupted sleep, getting up several times to go to the bathroom, can't go back to sleep. Any recommendations there?
Yeah, I want to kind of tie it in. Can you sleep too much, power nap, and also audiobooks probably in one answer. Is that audiobooks perfectly okay to do, provided is not like a murder mystery, right? So you don't want something that's highly engaging, that stimulate your brain to problem solve. So anything that you find relaxing, by all means, definitely podcasts, audiobooks, music. Although for maestro, you probably don't want them to listen to symphony because they would dissect that out into, pieces. So whatever's comfortable for you. Sleeping too much, what is too much? As I had said, and maybe you didn't catch that part of the lecture, is that we sleep until we feel refreshed and no longer sleepy, right? So that's probably good quality and quantity sleep. Now, having said that, there were studies showing that in a U-shaped curve, in those of us that slept less than 4 hours and those of us that sleep more than 9 hours, probably something is wrong. And so, and if you add a nap on top of that, then perhaps you should see someone and talk to them. But having said that, if you sleep 9 hours and you feel great when you wake up, you're ready to face the world, that's just your sleep. And perhaps there's nothing wrong with you. Now, having said that, if someone tells you, hey, your legs keep jerking and twitching throughout the night, or you're snoring like a banshee, well, then probably that would be evidence that something is wrong with your sleep, and you may want to talk to someone about it. Power nap is not a myth. So it's particularly handy in someone who can be a night owl. Usually is someone who's a night owl. What do I mean? If he or she cannot go to sleep until 3 or 4 in the morning, and they need to get up at 7 to go to work, go to school, and so on, there is no way that this person could be sleep satiated during the night. And so if you figure in a power nap, half an hour, less than an hour for sure, and be able to feel more refreshed and lessen the sleep debt that this person has accumulated and causing concentration difficulty of focus and problem solve, then that helps. But when it's longer than an hour, let's say 3 or 4 hours, well, then you will inherently reduce your nighttime sleep, right? Because the sleep pressure that we accumulate during the day, that basically is dissipated. So by the time we go to sleep, we don't have enough sleep pressure to push us into deeper sleep. CBD, and it depends on what your time schedule is. I will answer that. And then if there are no other questions, perhaps we just call it an afternoon. We don't have as much experience with the current CBD, although it is touted as, non-hallucinogenic. You don't get high from it because it doesn't have the THC component to it. But it's really hard to isolate because you're asking a lot of these vendors to be as pure as a pharmacist, right? It's almost impossible for them to do. And so usually there is at least some component of THC. What we know from the experiments that are done currently, and those are somewhat restricted just because of grant funding and so forth, are predominantly in the scanning studies of the brain maturation of young adults and teens, in those people that may have seizures, for which it is one of the forms of treatment for seizures, that what we know is the strains that are conducive to sleep has gotten much more potent, right, compared to the 60s and even 70s and so on. So those experiments that were conducted are very different from what we are looking at nowadays. Now, having said that, based on past experiments and of the limited sleep study that we had available, is that while, yes, some strains are more conducive to sleep in that they can induce deeper sleep, but the price to pay could be that we may be cashing out a little bit early, meaning that if we have more deep sleep today, when we don't use it, we may be having less deep sleep. And this could be an issue for someone that is using on a more regular basis, particularly for those that are using on a nightly basis. So while your sleep can get deeper, we can develop tolerance, and the nights that we choose not to use, the insomnia can get worse. So those would be some of the concerns.
Okay. Any last questions?
Yes, I'm on Zoom.
Cosco?
I'm Sharon.
Oh.
If I want to read at night, I like to read. So I sit in a chair and then I fall asleep in the chair, and then I find myself 2, 3 in the morning, and I don't want to fall asleep in the chair. And I also sometimes eat a lot. Sometimes I eat most of the time before I go to sleep, which is not good. So I stand up. I try to stand up and read. Then my back hurts, so I don't know what to do.
Right.
I don't have a good bed for reading.
Yeah. Again, more personal details, I do hesitate because this is being recorded. But having said that, a useful tool, this may be a good time to set your alarm, right? Although typically we don't want to set alarm, but for those that tend to doze off elsewhere, it may be a good thing to set your alarm for 30, 45 minutes. So if you're reading and you get sleepy, then if you have the alarm to remind you this is time to go to bed. But if you go to bed and you're wide awake, you may have to repeat this process. And there's some suggestion regarding Calm app. That's one of the apps. There's also Headspace. There are other sleep casts apps that you could use to help facilitate sleep. So mostly, go through exercises that are calming for you, whatever form that may be. Whether it's, for instance, a patient of mine says that he likes to just listen to David Attenborough because he talked in a monotone, and he finds that puts him to sleep. So if that's, again, something that helps you, by all means, but it will be highly individualized because we all have different requirements in terms of sleep, right? Some need a weighted blanket. Some people need a certain firmness of the mattress. Some people need a certain type of pillow. We generally don't advise patients to go buy a new mattress because they're incredibly expensive nowadays, nor do we want you to spend a couple $100s on a specialized pillow. So on the other hand, a very firm pillow for someone that has back pain may not be good because that may cause a sore spot to become activated. And so, and thank goodness there are different levels of firmness now we can program into the mattresses. And they do have these cooling gel pads on top as well, so that we don't perspire as much during sleep. So all those interventions can be helpful, but do check with your bed partner in terms of what their needs might be, just because what's good for you may not be good for your bed partner either, and we have to come to some kind of compromise.
I think there was a question. Kazuko, you want to unmute? Oh, did you have a question?
Yes, I put it in the chat, but I have some specific questions. Like, I belong to Kaiser, and do they have a sleep?
Yes.
Oh, they do. So I can ask my primary care person to refer me. Wonderful. That's all I needed to know. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much.
Yes.
Thank
of course.
you.
You're welcome. Other questions?
Did she answer your question?
Yeah.
There were a couple more I think you addressed, but one recommendation for audio for sleep, try Calm app was one recommendation.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, if there are no more questions, it's been such a pleasure talking with you. And again, a lot of these practices, they may sound simple to implement, but they actually, they do come with a certain degree of motivation and dedication. And if, again, the hardest thing for us to try to do is to push the brain to go to sleep when it's not ready. So the other part, take-home point there too, cardio exercise help deepen your sleep. And the last point is, the later we go to sleep, the more likely we're going to go into deeper sleep. But we do have to make sure that we get up at a scheduled time, but whatever time that is for your own body. It may be 9 o'clock in the morning. It may be 6 o'clock in the morning. So, and that time should be individualized. But if we add a morning walk, a sunlight exposure, eat or drink something that is consistent with our appetite at that time, it would help foster a alerting response to the brain to tell us that this is the proper time to get up. So wish you all healthy sleep and that you sleep soundly during the night. But if there was any questions, please by all means reach out through Jill.
Thank you so much, Ken. It was really informative, and we've recorded this. Yeah, so we'll have it available for you to share. I see people clapping. I don't know that you can see that.
I can see. Thank you so much. It's been my pleasure. Hope to talk with you another time if there's a need. Okay.
Great.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
You're welcome.